niggas?
You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another book review. I know I'm doing another one of these so soon after my previous one, but what can I say? I've really wanted to review this book recently. Now, 1984 by George Orwell is my favorite book of all time. I've read it multiple times. I've seen all 3 movie adaptations, and just this last week, I recently listened to an audiobook version on YouTube by this guy named Steve Parker Audiobooks. And this book did recently enter the public domain. So, in theory, I could even do a reading of it if I wanted to in the future. I definitely wouldn't do as good a job as he did, but if people are interested, I could always theoretically do that. But I first read this book back in high school, and one of the reasons I love this book so much is obviously because I'm a very anti-authoritarian person. And this book was a bleak vision of the future that George Orwell had back when he wrote it. Obviously, it's a fictional story, and it takes it to many extremes. But the thing is it's very topical and applicable to today. As I mentioned when I did that video a while back called Orwell Was Right, many things that are in this book are shockingly similar to things that are going on and being said. Obviously, this goes to a whole other extent, but it's scary how many things resemble this. So what 1984 is about is a guy by the name of Winston Smith, who lives in the country of Oceania, which is a superstate, because the world has become nothing but 3 superstates. There's Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia. All the other countries were basically abolished and absorbed by those. And within Oceania, there are several ministries of government. Winston happens to work at one of these ministries, the Ministry of Truth. All of these ministries have very ironic names, because they're all based on doing the exact opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. For instance, the whole point of the Ministry of Truth is they fabricate history and fiction and everything. So, for instance, they make the newspapers, they make the books and movies and things that people have, and they fabricate it all. But not only that, but they go back and they get older things, rewrite them, and then destroy all of the older versions of those things, and then replace them with their rewritten versions, and act like that's never been done, and act like that's just how they are, that's how they've always been. They completely control the past by rewriting it over and over again, and then replacing the old versions with the new versions without acknowledging that they've done that. So they take a book off a shelf, throw it in what they call a memory hole, which takes it to a furnace and burns it, and then replace it with the exact same book, or at least one that looks identical, but when you open it up, the contents are different because they replace the different things to fit their narrative. Again, the Ministry of Truth is only one of 4 ministries. There's, of course, the Ministry of Peace, which is ironically their ministry for war, and Oceania is constantly at war with one of the other 2 superstates, East Asia or Eurasia, and then they lie and say, oh, we've always been at war with East Asia, or we've always been at war with Eurasia, because they constantly change it back and forth and just pretend that they've never changed it. In addition to that, there's the Ministry of Plenty, which supplies food, but does a piss-poor job of it. In the book, they do point out the Ministry of Plenty, ironically, kind of is like starvation because of how little the rations are. And they'll lie and say that they raise the rations when they actually lower them. For instance, early on in the book, there's a point where the chocolate ration was lowered from 30 grams to 20 grams, but they say that they've raised it to 20 grams, because everything has to be a positive. The party always has to be doing good for the people. And then the 4th and final ministry is the worst one, which is the Ministry of Love. You don't find out much about that until later in the book, but earlier on they do still hint at it, that, people who disappear, who become unpersons, who are vaporized, basically they're taken to the Ministry of Love, and then they're just erased from all records and nobody knows what happens to them. Again, we get to see what happens later on in the book, but early on, it's very mysterious and ominous. The party, which is the power in the book, is supposedly ran by this omnipresent being known as Big Brother. Big Brother doesn't exist. That's pretty clear based on some comments O'Brien makes later in the book. But he's a figurehead, and he's supposed to be the embodiment of the party. The Big Brother, the party, they spy on you all the time, because they have these things called telescreens. And keep in mind, this was written before TVs were a thing. This was written back in 1948, hence the year was just inverted for the title. But they had something called a telescreen that would spy on you and play you propaganda. So it was like a two-way TV. that could see you, and you could see and hear it. But Winston, the main character, isn't happy with Big Brother and the party and the way his life's been going. He's been questioning it and having doubts. And so one day on a whim, he buys a secret journal and begins secretly keeping a journal, just out of view of the telescreen in his apartment where he can sit and not be seen. As it goes on, he does more things that are rebellious. For instance, party members aren't supposed to intermingle and make love to each other, things like that. Basically, sex was only permitted within marriage, and marriage was always approved by the party and never allowed just for love or attraction, only for practicality. But there will be spoilers from this point on, so do be warned. But Winston ends up with this girl named Julia, who's also someone who hates the party. And the two of them begin having a sexual relationship in secret in this hidden room above a store in the Prole sector. Now, the Prole is kind of slang for the proletariat, which is like the working class. The proletariat are not subject to the same rules as the party are. They're basically allowed to live free, but they're very heavily watched, and if there's any of them that are too rowdy, then the party deals with them. But for the most part, the proles are able to do what they want. They're just a lot lower intelligence, or at least they're perceived that way, because they're not really in the know about the stuff that goes on with the party. But Winston starts renting this room above a store in the Prole sector, and having his relationship with Julia there. Eventually, they reach out to this guy named OBrien, who is an inner party member. As you can imagine, the inner party are a lot more like higher ranking and officious than the regular party members. Well, Winston has this just gut feeling that OBrien is someone who he can talk to about things. And then later on, OBrien gives him reason to suspect that even more by mentioning his friend Syme, who had been recently vaporized. So, mentioning him is a big no-no because he's an unperson. He never existed. And so, since OBrien brings that up, Winston reaches out to him. And long story short, he thinks that OBrien is part of something called the Brotherhood, which is this underground resistance fighting against the party, supposedly, created by this guy named Emmanuel Goldstein. Now, it's left ambiguous as to whether or not Goldstein or the Brotherhood actually exist. I don't think they do. It's my opinion that they're completely made up for the party to control people and give them some sort of false sense of hope. But they're also an enemy to give shape to, because they have something called the 2 minutes hate, where they have to go up and everyone shows how much they hate Emmanuel Goldstein and the Brotherhood. But OBrien tells them, yeah, I'm totally part of the Brotherhood, and gives Winston a copy of Goldstein's book. And as he's reading Goldstein's book to Julia, during one of their many encounters in the room above the shop, they find out that they've been being watched the whole time, because there was a telescreen hidden behind the picture in the shop, and the shopkeeper was a member of the inner party. Again, rereading it after the first time, you pick up on that very early on, and, you can kind of suspect it early on, too, because the shopkeeper seems a little bit too distinguished to be one of the proles, and just doesn't typically seem like your normal member of the proles. But on top of that, Winston reaching out to OBrien, I thought was always very, very much an easy mistake to spot. You can tell OBrien's clearly setting you up, because, spoiler, OBrien is like the highest ranking party official that actually physically is confirmed to exist in the book. I'm sure there's people above him, but he's the only one we really see that he interacts with that's that high up. And then later on, OBrien would be the one to torture him in the Ministry of Love. But yeah, it just seems too good to be true, because OBrien immediately and conveniently reaches out to Winston after Winston starts having thoughts of reaching out to him. And he's been talking with Julia about this while they've been in the room, and as I said, turns out they've been spied on the whole time in the room. The party's heard everything they've said, all the anti-party slogans and things they've said to each other, and how they want to bring down Big Brother, and their illicit meetings, and how they wanted to join the Brotherhood, all this other stuff. And once they get caught and apprehended, they're both taken to the Ministry of Love. We don't get to see what kind of torture Julia goes through. It'd be interesting to see if there was supplemental material that told us that. Unfortunately, George Orwell has long since passed. But we never get to see what happens to Julia. Obviously, I would assume it's similarly horrible. But Winston's in there, he's kicked and beaten and, starved and tortured, and all this other horrible stuff happens to him. They use this machine that, zaps the hell out of him and makes him feel immense pain. And basically, they have to get him down to where he not only obeys, but he understands why, and he loves it. They have to break you so much that you actually like the fact that you're being oppressed. They have to completely rewire your brain through this horrible torture to make you accept the nonsense they're pushing. And eventually this culminates with getting Winston to betray Julia, which their idea of betrayal is not confessing each other to the party, because they already knew they'd do that as soon as they got caught, because they realized from the start they'd get caught eventually. Their idea of betrayal is to stop loving each other, which eventually they do, because they're taken to Room 101, which is where you experience the worst thing imaginable, which is different for everyone. So they take you and make you suffer your worst fear. With Winston, it's rats. So they get this helmet that's like this basket filled with rats, and it has like this little gate, and they're like pushing it onto his head, and right before it's about to get to where the rats can start gnawing at his face, he says, you know, give it to Julia, not me, make Julia go through this, like, and that was the goal, was to make him betray Julia. And then, of course, eventually, Winston loves Big Brother, and the ending's a little ambiguous as to whether or not he actually gets shot. I always find it in the final chapter. The last couple paragraphs, I've never understood whether or not Winston is actually getting shot, if he actually ever left the Ministry of Love, or if he actually ever went to the Golden Chestnut Cafe. So it's a little confusing on to whether or not he actually ends up getting shot. I think he does. I'm of the opinion that he does get shot at the end of the book. But the point is, he accepts that he'll get shot, and he loves Big Brother. So even if he doesn't get shot, he accepts it'll happen eventually, and he's okay with it, and he loves Big Brother. Hence, the last four words of the book, he loved Big Brother, which, super chilling. Now, why I love this book so much, like I said, I'm very anti-authoritarian. This book is very dystopian, and shocking authoritarian stuff happens in this book. Orwell himself was also very anti-authoritarian. I don't agree with everything that George Orwell thought, because he was also a socialist. I'm very against socialism myself. And this book itself is very anti-communist. The party is very clearly communist, and it's very clearly a critique of communism. Whereas I think he did more of a critique of capitalism and Animal Farm, which is also a great book. Even though I do actually like capitalism, I do consider myself a capitalist, I do think Animal Farm is still a really good book that I might review sometime in the future, because I've read it as well. And I've also watched the cartoon. I've also seen all three movie adaptations of 1984, which are all good in their own right. But yeah, it's a very bleak and dark book, very bleak vision of the future. I just think it's very good and topical, and it shows us just how horrible things can be if authoritarianism takes complete and total hold of the world. I love it. It's absolutely my favorite book of all time. I plan on doing a top 10 favorite books. This will be number 1, obviously. But, I felt that it deserved its own review. And as for the audiobook version by Steve Parker Audiobooks, I'm going to link that down below, because I think everyone should listen to that, because it is easily the best audiobook I've ever listened to. Because not only does he read it, but he adds sound effects, there's music, there's ambience, and there's even multiple voice actors for some of the roles. So I absolutely think that the Steve Parker audiobook version is absolutely worth listening to. And of course I own a physical copy. And the movies are good, too. 1984 is a very dark and depressing story, because it doesn't have a happy ending. It has a very bleak and unhappy ending. And I think that's another thing I really like about it, is just how dark it is, and how raw it is, and how it leaves you feeling just empty when you finish it, because nobody wins. Winston loses everything. His dignity's taken from him. His identity's taken from him. Everything he stands for is destroyed and taken from him. And that's how it ends. That's why I think it's a really good book, and I think everyone should read it. It's very topical. Like I said, there's plenty of parallels, obviously not to the same degree, but concepts such as doublethink and other things like that have definitely made it into the common verbiage because of this book. And I absolutely think people should check it out if you haven't read it. I'm glad that I read it back in high school. I'm glad that I've read it multiple times since. I'm glad that I listened to this audiobook by Steve Parker Audiobooks, because again, goddamn, that's good. And like I said, maybe one day if people want me to do a reading of this, I will, because again, it is public domain now. But, yeah, I really like this book, in case you couldn't tell. But I think that's all I really have to say about 1984 today. I hope you've enjoyed this review. I've certainly enjoyed this book. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye. Have a good one. Toodles.
What a grand adventure this has been. God bless us, everyone.
I'm gonna fucking die here, Jack!
Autobots, suck my dick!